Thank you for the recommendation on the Jewish Study Bible.
Oh.
I actually got it. It's been very interesting, and
Great.
I'm also taking another class where it was helpful. I'm taking a class on Judaism in the Hellenistic period, taught by a Yale Div School professor.
We're going to touch briefly on that today.
I know you've been it's already been very helpful having your preview before launching into that class.
Very briefly, but it's Hellenism is central to the formation of Judaism. We are more Greek than we realize.
I'm learning that, yes.
Many years ago, when we lived in Detroit, my husband decided he wanted to go get a master's degree down at Wayne State University. And I said, well, we were newlyweds. I said, you're not leaving me home 2 nights a week. So I was a Spanish and French teacher. So I said, well, I'll learn Greek. So I went and I took the modern Greek class. And I was the only one in the class who was not Greek, married to a Greek, or planning to visit Greece. And I got through 2 quarters before I had a terrible miscarriage and I had to stop. But it was great fun. I learned all sorts of very good things like to tavliomu, my table. You know.
Well, there's a lot of Greek in Jewish religious and cultural vocabulary, from the word synagogue, as I said, to the word Bible, to afikomen, to sandek at the Brit Milah. All of these are words of Greek origin that become integral to Jewish and Western religious vocabulary. Well, welcome everybody.
Okay.
Nice to see so many faces with us again today from many different geographic spots. The traditional prayer is that we will be brought together from the 4 corners of the earth. And now I can see you all coming together from the 4 corners of my Zoom screen. So me'arba kanfot haZoom. From the 4 corners of the Zoom, we come together. Yeah. For those of you who are grammatically inclined concerning the last conversation on the 2 different types of Sheva. Grammatically, they are called, in Hebrew, the Sheva Nach, which means the Sheva of stopping, and the Sheva Na, which means the Sheva of slurring or of movement. So one stops the syllable, the other slurs you into the next syllable. If you look it up in grammatical terminology in the West, you will have them referred to as the shewa, S-H-E-W-A. That's how the shewa is called in grammar books in the West. And one is the shewa mobile, which means the moving shewa. And the other is the resting shewa. So one stops the syllable, the other kind of slurs you into the next syllable. That's simply it. And there's nothing to memorize about it. You just kind of get to feel it as you go along. There are grammatical reasons, but not worth delving into. And Dina explained it very clearly. One, you stop; the other, you move into the next.
What is the schwa you're talking about?
You weren't there.
Oh, I know. I have no background for this.
The vowel that is symbolized by 2 dots under a Hebrew consonant.
Oh, okay.
Under a consonant is called a sheva in Hebrew, or a shewa in Western grammatical terminology. And the shewa exists in other languages too, just identified differently.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on. Today we are going to, according to the published schedule, enter into our 2nd moment of great ages and ideas of Judaism. And we have identified that as the rabbinic and the medieval periods. I hope that we can do justice to it in an hour and a half or so. We will probably do a little bit more of rabbinic and then pick up medieval when we pick up the modern period next time. I told you last time that, that whereas the Bible is foundational to Judaism, it is not the element that gives formative expression to our tradition. That is, you could not live a Jewish life if you were just to go by what the Bible teaches. Judaism is the Bible plus the accretions, the interpretations, the adaptations that are brought to it by means of what we call the rabbinic tradition. And I'll go back to that in a moment. Perhaps the best way to say it is that Judaism is not the religion of the Bible. Judaism is the religion from the Bible, meaning that we use the biblical text and its traditions and its history as foundational, but upon it, Judaism builds another layer in the edifice of the development or the unfolding of the tradition. And that is generally referred to as the rabbinic period. To take you back to the last stages of the biblical period, Judaism underwent the influence of many cultures, conquering cultures throughout the Middle East: Babylonia, Persia, Hellenism, Alexander the Great and his conquests of the Middle East, and then the Romans. All these influences come to bear on what eventually Judaism will become. And following the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in the year 586 before the Common Era, that is the 6th century before the Common Era, biblical Judaism already begins to acquire some new nuances. It begins to feel the influence of another great world culture, the language of another great world culture, and then with the Greek influence that eventually will lead to the Roman period, Judaism really becomes not just the religion of the people of Judea, but a religion that begins to be recognized as part of the greater culture of the ancient world. Remember, the Bible is translated into Greek during the early Hellenistic period in the year 300, approximately before the Common Era. Rendering the Bible into Greek was necessary for two reasons. One, because Greek people were interested in learning about this tradition, these people who lived in their midst. But another, we can't lose sight of this, because many Jews did not know Hebrew enough to read the Bible. They were Greek-speaking Jews. Like most American Jews today, are English-speaking Jews. We may use Hebrew, we may have a smattering of it. You people are going to be scholars by the end of this course, but American Jews are not Hebraically literate Jews. We use Hebrew, and then there are many people who have very little or no knowledge. So the translation of the Bible into Greek was necessitated by both information that was being brought to the outside world and to make Judaism more accessible to the Jews who lived outside of the land of Israel, dispersing through the growing diaspora of Judaism. Later, when the Romans would take over after the Greeks, the Bible would be translated into Latin. And that would become the Bible that would primarily influence the formation of Christianity. So from the Greek through the Latin. So we have to understand Judaism not as Judaism here always has been part of a greater civilizational conglomerate or world, and Judaism has been influenced by that. Today we will try to understand how Judaism transitions from being the religion that is contextualized in the books that we call the Tanakh, Torah, prophets, writings, or the Bible, remember, a Greek word meaning books, to a religion that is now the interpretation of and application of the teachings of the Bible to a new reality. Remember, who is the religious leader or functionary in the Bible? It is the priest. The priest labored first in various sanctuaries across the land, but that eventually consolidated in the city of Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem becomes the seat of religion, and it is also tied in comfortable and uncomfortable ways in the biblical period and during the Roman period to the monarchy or to the sovereign. And the priests then represent, in the course of time, a very static and a very conservative and a very accommodationist to the outside powers expression of Judaism. So during the Roman period, already with roots going back to the Greek period, we begin to discern a diversification of religious and social orientation among the Jews of the land of Israel. And let us not forget that there were Jews living outside the land of Israel in the Greek diaspora in Alexandria. The synagogue in Alexandria, before the destruction of the temple, was supposed to have been one of the largest synagogues ever constructed. The Talmud tells that when the prayers would be chanted, the people at the front would raise flags so that the people in the back could know when to give the appropriate responses. That was before microphones and before Zoom. So groups begin to develop in the land of Israel in response to the external powers. One of the established groups is what is referred to in the sources as the Sadducees. The Sadducees represented primarily the priestly class of Judaism, the ones who ran the temple. They were the upper social, cultural class. They were not only involved in the administration of the temple, but in establishing the formal relationships with the official Roman Empire. And they were by nature a very conservative, established group. They were okay with things as they were. The Romans respected them. They had the temple, they ran the affairs, they offered the sacrifices, the people brought their contributions. So think of them as the establishment. Next to this Sadducean group, there was evolving a different cadre of teachers, and they were coming, they eventually became known as the Pharisees, Pharisees. Sadducees, and the name Sadducees is associated with one of the high priests, Sadok, and now the Pharisees. The word Pharisees meant interpreters. Some also associated with the word separatists, those who separated themselves for purity purposes. But the Pharisees were people who respected the temple as an important Jewish legacy from the biblical period, but they represented primarily a kind of middle class, growing intellectual group, merchants, artisans, some tenders of vineyards. And they believed that in addition to the written Torah, which was the central document of the Sadducean tradition, the Sadducees went by the Torah as it was written. Begin to think of in contemporary constitutional terms. They believed the Torah in its original form. They were originalists. But then came the Pharisees, and they approached Torah differently. They say the Torah is not a static document. It has to be interpreted. It is a malleable document that has to adjust to different circumstances. And the Pharisees were the early teachers of what is known in Judaism as the oral Torah, the Torah shebe'al peh, the Torah that is taught by word of mouth. So there is the written text and there is the interpretive tradition. The Pharisees bring that interpretation. They were more malleable. They were trying to find ways of applying the Torah to new circumstances, especially after the destruction of the temple. After the temple was destroyed, a synagogue Judaism would begin to take form, and the foundations of the synagogue precede the destruction of the temple. But especially after the destruction of the temple, where there was no central location for people to bring their sacrifices, there were no priests to offer the sacrifices. Now the Pharisaic tradition begins to take wing, and the teachers and interpreters that succeed that tradition and make it succeed, we know as the rabbis, the early rabbis. The difference between this new type of leader, the rabbi, and that old type of leader, the priest, is that the priests belong to a caste. You couldn't elect to be a priest. You had to be born to the tribe of Levi, or if you wanted to be those were the Levites, the assistants to the priest. Or if you wanted to be a priest, you had to be born into one of the clans of the tribe of Levi, the Kohen. So within the priesthood, there were different layers: the Kohanim, the high priests, and the Levites, the assistants to the priest. The rest of the people were the people of Israel, of the different tribes. So with the destruction of the temple, the aristocracy, the hierarchy, the rulership of the priests is no longer in charge, no longer the hegemony. Priests continue to have important social influence even after the temple is destroyed, but now the rabbis begin to gather people in academies to teach this oral Torah and how Judaism might become applicable to the life of Jews, from the observance of the Sabbath to civil legislation to living in community, holidays, and all types of different areas of life. So we have the Sadducees, the priestly class, the Pharisees, and eventually the rabbis. These were not inherited positions. You weren't born to be a rabbi. You apprenticed to be a rabbi. You went to the academy. You learned yourself with somebody else. You acquired a teacher. One of the teachings of the rabbis is make for yourself a teacher. Acquire for yourself a chaver, someone with whom you can study. If you want to get a flavor of rabbinic Judaism information, go to a tractate, to a volume of the Mishnah, we will talk about that in a minute, called Pirkei Avot, the sages of the ancestors, the teachings of the sages. And you will find a full Pirkei Avot in the prayer book that we use at Beth-El, because Pirkei Avot is a beloved and studied text. It's especially studied between Pesach and Shavuot. And there you will get a sense of the thinking of the early rabbis. It's very influenced by Greek philosophic minds. They were kind of Stoics. They took life as it was, but they built upon it. One of the great teachings of the early rabbis is if you are planting a tree and somebody comes and tells you the Messiah has come, you first finish planting your tree and then go see if the Messiah has come. They lived in the here and now, especially during the Roman period. They tried to hold the people back from fantasies of messianic redemption and rebellion. So they were trying to keep the people together. Aside from the Pharisees, there was another group known as the Essenes. The word Essenes, E-S-S-E-N-E-S, comes from the word Hasid in Hebrew, the pietists. These were people who, for the most, separated themselves from city life. A significant number of them has been identified in what is known as the Qumran community that gave us the famous Qumran scrolls that were discovered in the Judean deserts in 1948 by a Bedouin kid throwing stones, and he threw a stone and he heard something crack, and he went up into the cave, and behold, he found jugs filled with parchment with documents, and these have become central to the understanding of the Judaism of the period, and they are held in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, a museum that was built for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these people were people who abandoned city life, who believed in the imminent coming of a Messiah, who believed that the Roman world and anybody who associated with them were sinners, and who believed in the imminent upheaval of civilization when God would send the appointed teacher, leader, Messiah to redeem them. The fact is that there were many such groups that yearned for the coming of a Messiah. The word Messiah is a biblical word. It is applied to King David and to other people. It means the anointed one who was anointed for rule. King David was appointed for rule. And the belief at this time was that there would be a descendant of King David who would come and redeem the Jews from Roman oppression, restore them to their land and sovereignty, and right all the wrongs that have been inflicted upon Jews and bring peace to all humanity. Many Jews held to this belief. Some were willing to fight for it, and they were known as the Zealots. The Romans called them the Sicari because they carried daggers. Sicari is the Latin word for a dagger. Some were revolutionaries, others were pietists. There were many such groups. One of those groups centered around a teacher known as Jesus of Nazareth. That group in the early centuries of the Common Era would grow to become the religion of Christianity in the course of time. But in its early period, it was one of many sects within Judaism. So early Christianity fits into the diversity of Jewish life that existed during the Second Temple period and following the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the year 70. Following the destruction of the temple by the Romans, the priests are out of luck. Most of the zealots are crushed in military battle by the Romans, and then different strands of spirituality continue. What we call Judaism today is the result of the coming together of the Pharisaic and rabbinic traditions to create an interpretive Judaism based on the oral teachings, on the oral Torah. In the year following the destruction of the temple, or during the period of the siege of Jerusalem, a famous Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai negotiates with the Roman general that he should give him a little city outside of Jerusalem called the city of Yavne or Jamnia, where he can gather disciples. And in the city of Yavne in Hebrew, Jamnia in Greek, is established the first rabbinic academy under Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was a descendant of a spiritual descendant of Hillel, who had lived in the first century before the Common Era and sought to carry forth the teachings that Hillel began to develop with other sages of his period about the oral Torah. So in Yavne, which was established in the year 90, we can claim post-temple Judaism is founded. And in fact, it is out of the conclave of Yavne that what we today call the Bible, those 24 books about which we talked last time, was finally decided upon. These are the books of our Tanakh, of our biblical tradition. And that is how rabbinic Judaism now begins to emerge. And what does it mean that it begins to emerge? Well, it's a process of biblical interpretation that is both based on the biblical text and verse, but also on precedent and behavior of the people. Eventually, the rabbinic tradition will yield monumental amounts of literature that contain the teachings of the rabbis over the generations. And I would ask Jackie if she could post for us the sheet entitled Evolution of Jewish Law.
Coming right up.
And the word should really not be law there, but of Jewish teaching. Evolution of the Torah tradition. This is a misnomer that comes from the Western mistranslation of the word Torah as law. The word Torah means teaching. Okay, there you go. So imagine the Torah is the Torah along with the rest of the Bible is the sacred literature of the Jews. And now the rabbis begin to develop teachings upon that law. The first layer of teaching is called the Mishnah, which means the teaching. And it is a collection of oral teachings about the Bible, its laws, from ritual laws to prayer laws, to agricultural laws, to marriage laws, to divorce laws, to holiday laws. And the Mishnah is contained, if you could flip that page around for us, Jackie. The Mishnah, which is in the back of that page, contains 6 orders or categories. Bring a little bit closer. There you go. 6 categories. And you can see the categories. First order is Zeraim, which means seeds, agricultural laws. Second order, Moed, which means seasons or holidays. Third order, Nashim, which means women and deals with marriage, divorce, family law. The next one is Nezikin. Here we enter civil and criminal law. And then Kodashin and Tohorot have to do with personal purity and ritual practices stemming from the temple period. The Mishnah consists of 6 orders and 63 tractates. 63 tractates. And the Pirkei Avot, to which I referred earlier, is one of them. It's in the 4th order, Nezikin, towards the bottom of Nezikin. And it is the only order in the Mishnah that is not about law. It is about proverbial teaching, advice, counseling, pedagogical insights. So it's a wonderful way to enter the world and the language of the Mishnah without having training in the legal dimension. And as I say that, you need to understand that Jewish teaching of the oral law, of which the Mishnah is the first layer, the oral law has 2 different expressions. One is legal, what we call in the tradition halakha, H-A-L-A-K-H-A-H, halakha, the law. It is prescriptive. It tells you what to do, how to act. It gives you a legal guidance. And then the other side of the rabbinic tradition in the oral Torah is Agadah. And Agadah means narrative, moral traditions. This is not prescriptive, but what we might call heuristic, educational, informative, illustrational. So the Mishnah is primarily halacha, primarily legal collections, but it also has touches of Agadah. And then the Mishnah, which contains materials and interpretations from the 2nd pre-Christian century to the beginnings of the 3rd century of the Common Era, is codified. It is brought together into the text that it is today by Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was the head of the Jewish community in the land of Israel in the 2nd, 3rd century during the Roman period. And he is the editor or the collector of the Mishnah. The Mishnah will be the first layer, the foundation of what will become the Talmud. Flip the sheet again, please. And there we go. So from the Mishnah flows the interpretive tradition of the next generations of rabbis, and that is known as the Gemara, G-E-M-A-R-A. And there are two bodies of interpretive Gemara tradition, one that develops in the land of Israel, incorrectly labeled Jerusalem because it was mostly developed in the Galilee and Tiberias. So the Palestinian, if you want to call it, with the term that the Romans gave to the land at that time, or the land of Israel Gemara. And the other is the academies in Babylonia. Jews were living in Babylonia, many since the Babylonian period, and others who went there as a result of the destruction of Jerusalem and the capture of the land by the Romans. So the Babylonian Gemara, and it is actually the Babylonian Gemara which becomes the more important in the ongoing formation of Jewish life, because it has to deal with the life of Jews outside of the land of Israel, and that's where most Jews were living. The Mishnah plus the Gemara constitute what we call the Talmud. The word Talmud means teaching. We Jews love the word teaching. The word Torah means teaching. The word Mishnah means teaching by repetition. The word Talmud means from lamud, from limud, talmid. It means to teach. So that is the first layer of rabbinic tradition, the Mishnah plus the Gemara. The Gemara is completed in the 6th, 7th century of the Common Era. So it's a collection of centuries of teaching and interpretation. And just like the Mishnah consists of 6 orders and 63 tractates inside of them, the Gemara is built on the structure of the Mishnah. And Jackie, if you could post now the next sheet that is called the Talmud. It's a I'm going to stop in a few moments for you to ask questions, but I just wanted to put this out there. Did you find the sheet? Here you go. The Talmud. There you have the breakdown of the Mishnah into the 6 orders. And so the Mishnah can exist by itself, or it can contain the commentary of the Talmud, which is the Gemara. Flip the page, please. And there is a page of Talmud for you. That is how the Talmud is generally printed. For those of you who are attentive to detail, that's one page. Forget the English on the side, just the center of the screen. There's a center column with a little decoration in the top that introduces the first word. And that number 1 next to that word indicates a quotation from the Mishnah. Then the number 2, like right down the middle of the column, indicates the beginning of the Gemara, which is the discussion of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew. The Gemara is for the most written in Aramaic, which is the language that the Jews in Babylonia and in many parts of the ancient world would speak. So the Mishnah and the Talmud are the center column with the bigger print. Outside of it, like surrounding it like a tree, like the core of the tree and the expanding circles, outside of it are commentaries. The commentary to the right is the commentary of a famous medieval rabbi by the name of Rashi, Rabbi Solomon, son of Isaac. He lived in France, Troyes, in the 12th century. On the left side are the commentaries of Rashi's grandchildren, the Tosafot, and they comment both on the text of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and they comment at the same time on the comment of Rashi. And this was in Central Europe. And then the outside little notations are additional references and further commentaries from different generations. So as you can see, the tradition evolves in a very literary way, or it's recorded in a literary way, but it is giving expression to what the rabbis and the synagogue understood to be the ongoing life of the Jewish community in great detail. It is a growing practical guide to being a Jew. And this document that is in your face only takes us through the Well, the center document takes us through the 6th, 7th century, and then the commentaries on the side are medieval. This is the core of the training of becoming a rabbi, especially an Orthodox rabbi in contemporary times. To be qualified to be a rabbi is to be competent with a significant amount of these texts. And now we come back to the evolution of Jewish law sheet again, please, Jackie. The evolution of Jewish law sheet or of Jewish teaching. There you go. Let's move it up. You notice that the flow of tradition does not stop with the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud. It continues into the Middle Ages with comments, decisions, commentaries, and eventually the codification or the pulling together of these traditions into more accessible codes for Jewish behavior and law. The most famous among them are the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides, whom we will encounter a little bit later, the rabbi in 12th century Egypt and Spain, and the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century by Rabbi Joseph Caro. To be an Orthodox Jew is to live one's life according to the teachings of the codes. Ashkenazim by Joseph Caro with the commentaries on top of it of Ashkenazi teachers, and many Sephardic Jews follow are more inclined to follow the teachings of Maimonides as well. So that is kind of the legal scope, and this tradition continues till this day in what is known as responsa literature, questions and answers, applications of Jewish law. But do not think that the tradition was only a legal tradition, halakha, because there was also a moral, interpretive, pedagogical tradition known as Agada. And that also yields a huge body of literature known as the Midrash. The word Midrash means continued teaching, continued interpretation of the tradition. So to give you a little sense of the flavor of the Talmud, both in Agada and Halakha, let's go to the sheet known as About the Greatest Commandment, Jackie. Let me pause as we shift to the next sheet. The Greatest Commandment. It's another sheet. Any questions so far? I'll take a deep breath. Yes.
I have a question. Pardon.
I heard a voice and then I saw a hand. Who's
Yes.
talking?
This is Martine speaking.
Yes, Martine.
I have a question about the comments. How did we manage to collect all those comments at one point? How did we get to have these comments, actually organized and appearing into the teaching of the priest or the future rabbi? How did that work? I mean, in an area where a lot of people did not really know how to write and read.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, it's an amazing feat, and it's all transmitted originally by oral teaching until it begins to be written down. The rabbinic tradition is a highly literate and skilled tradition. And even what is amazing is how these things were preserved before the development of printing, right? The same thing happens in the Christian monastic tradition. In the monasteries, they preserved handwritten documents. So all this was very meticulously written and preserved by scribes who specialize in taking down the traditions of the teachers and collecting them, and various editorial processes, until all this begins to be published in the Middle Ages in printed form. But there was an amazing uniformity. There are variances, and part of the scholarship of the Talmud and the Mishnah is to find these different traditions. As the process of trying to unify the tradition develops, some extraneous teachings are eliminated, right? The tradition is what we get down from those who preserved it. So there were other expressions that did not kind of eventually make it. Already in the Middle Ages, in the 9th, 10th century, we find a internal revolt against the rabbinic tradition of Judaism by a group of Jews become known as the Karaites. And the Karaites develop in the 9th, 10th century, and they are kind of back to the Bible Jews. They want to go back to the original biblical texts to understand Judaism rather than go by the teachings of the rabbinites, the rabbis. And for a long time, Karaites and rabbinites engaged in very interesting discussions among themselves. Eventually, it is rabbinic Judaism that emerges to the top, and Karaism dwindles. To this day, there are in the land of Israel descendants of the Karaite Jews that are more biblically centered rather than rabbinically centered. But the process was an ongoing, very disciplined process. So this sheet here contains a few things about the rabbinic tradition that I wanted to bring to your attention. Remember, there are 63 tractates. The Talmud the Gemara takes 36 of those tractates and does additional teaching on them. So the Talmud is only 36 of the 63 tractates of the Mishnah, but altogether they are considered a unified work. Here's a sample teaching that may be familiar to many of you. It comes from the tractate entitled Shabbat, which is the tractate that deals with laws about the Sabbath. And B, you see at the bottom of the first quote there to the left, this is the whole Torah. It says B Shabbat 31a. It simply means this is from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Shabbat, page 31a. And in the Talmud, the pages are numbered 31a, 31b, 32a, 32b. It's the folio of the page. One side is A, one side is B. I'm going to show you a bigger page after we take this off the screen. This is a famous passage. Who would like to read it for us? I need a reader. I'm going out of voice. Can somebody proclaim it, please? Tony, you have to unmute yourself.
I am working on it. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, this is the whole Torah. A non-Jew once came to Shammai and said to him, "Convert me to Judaism on condition that you can teach me the whole Torah while I am standing on one foot." With a builder's measuring rod in his hand, Shammai angrily threw him out. The non-Jew then went to Hillel and repeated his request. "Convert me to Judaism on condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I am standing on one foot." Hillel converted him and taught him as follows: "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbors. This is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Now go and study."
Okay, very famous passage. Hillel and Shammai, two great sages of the 1st century before the Common Era. During the Roman period, before the destruction of the temple, Hillel is seen as the patient, more forgiving person. Shammai is the stricter, less receptive person. In the Christian tradition, many of the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament can be found in one way or another in the teachings of Hillel. Okay, so what is going on here? Can somebody not read it for me, but just summarize it in your own 2-3 sentences? I can't see everybody on the screen because of the page, so you can just start talking if you want. Father Kelly, good to have you back. Okay, so let me just quickly do it since we don't have volunteers. Essentially, this is the golden rule, right? what is hateful to you, do not do to another. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go study it. It appears in many traditions. In the New Testament, it is formulated by Jesus as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here it is, don't hurt others in ways that you would not want to be hurt. Perhaps even a little bit more descriptive, right? But that is not all there is to it. This is the essence of Torah. The word whole there, it kind of means this is the essence. But there is more to it. Go study. So Judaism is a religion, a tradition of study. Okay, we go to the next side of the page. The question arises, what is the most important teaching of the Torah? And Rabbi Akiba says, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the great principle of Torah. Who else teaches that?
The Catholic do teach that in the
I'm
same
sorry?
way.
I'm sorry?
The Catholic do teach that in the same way.
Of course, because it's a New Testament saying of Jesus. Jesus is asked, tell us what are the most important teachings? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And what is Jesus doing there? He is being very Pharisaic. He is quoting two passages from the Torah that reflect what many other rabbis consider to be the essentials of Torah. Here, so Rabbi Akiba believes that love your neighbor as yourself is the essence of Torah. Hold on one second. I think my daughter is at the door and I need to open. So I'm going to do a parental duty for 1 second. Okay, back. Okay, so another rabbi, Ben Azai, believed that the most important passage in the Torah is not love your neighbor as yourself, but this is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created Adam, God made him in the likeness of God, meaning that the human being and all descendants are of infinite value because we're all created in the image of God. Once Rabbi Heschel was asked, why does Judaism prohibit the making of images of God? And he responded, because there already is an image of God. The image of God is the human being, every human being. We continue. From Moses to Habakkuk, I'm not going to take you through all that, but rabbis eventually developed the notion that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, and then they go on to the process of distilling them to the most important commandment. Jackie, can we flip that page? There we go. So as you can see, the process of reducing the commandments to one goes on. So the rabbis were fascinated both by the volume of the teaching of the Torah, but at the same time, they were eager to bring Judaism down to its essence, to share it with the people. And the last reading there from Akiba to Moses is a very interesting reading. If you could raise it a little bit, please. Essentially, it tells us that a little anecdote, and notice how fanciful the rabbis are. This is, by the way, this is not halacha, this is not Jewish law, this is agadah. This is Jewish narrative, metaphor, metaphysics, heuristics, morality. So Moses finds himself in the academy of Rabbi Akiba in the 1st century, sitting in the back of the room, listening to class, and he cannot understand a word of what Akiba is saying. Akiva was living in the 2nd century. Moses lived in the 12th, 13th century before the Common Era. And Akiva is teaching Torah, but Moses doesn't understand a word of what Akiva is saying because it's not what he identifies with in the Torah. Finally, Akiva is asked, how do you know this? And Akiba replies, this is a teaching from Moses on Sinai, and Moses was pleased. Meaning that Moses accepts the fact that the teaching has evolved and at the same time remained faithful. Even though he could not understand it, it was being quoted in his name. And he understood then that Torah is not a static tradition, but an ongoing, unfolding, developmental tradition. So this gives you a taste of the mindset of rabbinic Judaism that I wanted to share with you. There's much more that I could share. Perhaps one more. Jackie, capital punishment in Judaism. Tori, you are right. I saw your post about Judaism like an onion, right? You peel it and peel it, but I hope it smells better than the onion, unless you like onions, right? Okay, capital punishment. Any lawyers among us? I know Betsy is a lawyer. Here is a discussion in the Mishnah and in the Talmud about the issue of capital punishment. Does Judaism support capital punishment, or is Judaism against capital punishment? Let's see what the rabbis of the Mishnah think. This is 2nd century Judaism, Roman period Judaism. And the question is asked in the Mishnah, how are witnesses inspired with awe? Meaning, how do we swear them in? How do we make sure that they're going to tell the truth? Witnesses in capital charges were brought in and warned. Perhaps what you say is based on, I mean, it's chanted the way it would be chanted in a rabbinic academy. Perhaps what you're going to say is based only in conjecture or hearsay, or is evidence from the mouth of another witness, or even from the mouth of a trustworthy person. Perhaps you're unaware, and ultimately we shall scrutinize your evidence by cross-examination and inquiry. Know then that capital cases are not like monetary or civil cases. In civil suits, one can make monetary restitution and effect his atonement, but in capital cases, one is held responsible for the accused's blood and the blood of his potential descendants until the end of time. So you better be careful that the testimony that you are going to give is correct, because if your testimony results in putting this person to death, you are responsible not only for the death of this person, but till the end of time. For thus we find in the case of Cain, who killed his brother Abel, that it is written, the bloods of thy brother cry unto me. A quote from Genesis. This is how the rabbis take the biblical text and apply it to a legal situation. It says in the Bible, when Cain killed Abel, he killed one person. But the text says, the bloods of your brother cry unto me from the earth. It doesn't say the blood of your brother, but the bloods of your brother, to teach you that it refers to his blood and the blood of his descendants forever. For this reason, the human being was created single, to teach you that whoever destroys one life destroys a whole world. So here we have a legal teaching on capital punishment at a time when supposedly it was permitted, but it was taken very seriously. Watch what you say. Your testimony in a capital punishment is of imminent, infinite consequence. And then that's the Mishnah. And then the Gemara, the latter sages, go in to discuss this Mishnah. And in the Gemara, our rabbis taught, what is meant by based on conjecture? What do you mean that the teacher said, that the judge says to the witness, your testimony cannot be based on conjecture for a capital case. Permit conjecture for a civil case, but not for a capital case. It means the judge says to him, perhaps you saw this man running after his fellow into a ruin. You ran after them, and when you caught up with them, you found them sword in hand with blood dripping from it, while the murdered man was writhing in agony. Okay, you were running after them. They went behind a wall in an old ruin. You lost sight of them. When you caught up with them, you saw that the man was dead and the man had a knife in his hand. If this is what you saw nothing. You didn't see the actual act, the committing of the act. No conjecture. You can't assume what happened. You have to have seen it. And then it continues with an example of that. So no conjecture is permitted in capital punishment in Judaism. And the teaching continues. Not only has it to be witnessed by a witness, you need to see, it needs to be seen simultaneously by two witnesses. Not only must it be seen simultaneously, but two witnesses. The witnesses have to have warned the perpetrator what you are going to do is a capital offense. Are you aware of that? And the perpetrator has to say, yes, and I'm still going to do it. So the tradition hedges capital punishment with all types of restrictions to make it virtually impossible. And later on in another Mishnah, we have this teaching, a Sanhedrin, that is a Jewish court of law, which executes a criminal once in 7 years, is a bloody court. Rabbi Eliezer, son of Azariah, said once in 70 years. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Torfan said, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, no person would have ever been executed. They were abolitionists when it came to capital punishment. Another rabbi disagrees, more conservative, Rabbi Simon ben Gamma says, well, they would have been responsible for the proliferation of murders in Israel. But here we have a very vivid, very lively, abbreviated discussion so that I could fit it on one page about the issue of capital punishment as the rabbinic tradition approaches it. So you can see here a very vigorous, very vivid, very real, down-to-earth conversation on a very real issue. Okay, off the sheet, on the screen, so we can see each other for a little bit. Thank you. Any questions, any comments? That's just a little taste of the rabbinic tradition. Here,
Rabbi Dennis?
yeah, let me just show you.
Okay.
This is one volume of the 36 tractates of the Talmud. And when you open it, you'll see pages arranged as you had seen that page, right? Now, the good thing is that you can get the Talmud in translation. And you can either get just an English translation, or there is a wonderful multi-volume incomplete edition by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who died recently. Great Talmudic scholar, and he has rendered the Talmud in translation and in the style of the Talmud with copious notes. So you can get a Steinsaltz Talmud and become a Talmudic scholar. Okay, question. I saw a question. Was it Tori or somebody else? Heather? Unmute. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Hi. In this canon of law, who is considered a person? So does a person have to be Jewish? Does a person have to be a man? Do they have to be of a certain age? Who can be witnesses? Who can be considered a perpetrator? What can you give a little context to that?
Yeah, it's like all laws, it is contextual and it applies to its period. Women were not permitted to be witnesses during this period. Gamblers were not permitted to be witnesses. So you can see that there were certain categories that were either because of their lack of reliability, or in the case of women, rabbis developed this whole notion that women are not obligated to the commandments in the same way that men are obligated to the commandments. And the rationale that they develop is that the role of the woman is to maintain society, to maintain the domestic side of the family. So if they were if they were to be obligated to the commandments, they would be taken away from the responsibility of building the building blocks of society. So this is their mindset. And the rabbis say that women are obligated to commandments that are not determined by a fixed time. A commandment that is not affected by a fixed time, women are obligated to. But then, if as you parse that, you realize that they're not prohibited from observing those commandments. They're just not obligated to observe those commandments. But when it comes in the legal field, there is no question that this was not a totally egalitarian tradition yet, and certain things would apply to males, and certain things would apply to Jews only. But the thrust of the tradition, as it eventually evolves, and whereas those of us who are progressivists and evolutionaries can find the traces of it, is in the direction of inclusion and humanism. But yes, there is no question around it that we're not living in the 21st century, and even in the 21st century, we're still struggling with some of these issues, right? Good observation. Thank you.
Rabbi Dennis?
Yes.
Question, when you were mentioning in Alexander, they translated into Greek. Is it correct to assume it was only the Torah that was translated into the Greek and nothing more?
Primarily the Torah. Other texts were eventually translated as well, but it began with the Torah. It was a Torah project. Eventually, the whole Bible was rendered into Greek and eventually into Latin. Yes, no question. Yes, I saw a lawyer wanting to ask a question there, buddy. And by the way, Father, the translation into Greek is commonly referred to as the Septuaginta, or the Septuagint, because it was done by 70 scholars. And according to the tradition, and you can believe this or not, they all went into separate rooms, worked on the translation as individuals, and then they came out, and behold, it was exact word for word translation that they all brought out. And I'll sell you a bridge somewhere too.
So, Rabbi Dennis, my question is, what's the current position on capital punishment? It seemed like there was reasons why not to allow it in the teaching.
Well, let me put it this way. In the United States, I'm sure that you will have the thrust of the Jewish community in the United States is against capital punishment. There are individual Jews who favor capital punishment. The state of Israel has abolished capital punishment as part of its legislative system, other than for treason against the state. Okay?
Thank you.
And crimes of genocide. Treason against the state and crimes of genocide. But in a practical way, there is no capital punishment for murder, for whatever the case might be, for in the society of the state of Israel, based on the thrust of the Jewish tradition.
Thanks.
Okay. Anything else?
I have a question about the diaspora and the laws. As we all know, the laws applies where we live. So my question is, why did we have to, how can we consider all those laws that have been put together as a tradition, as a guideline, or how do we look at that?
I'm not sure I got your whole question. You said the laws and the traditions, how do they?
Right, the laws and the tradition, especially when we are all in the diaspora, before we have the state of Israel coming up.
Well, traditions are part of the folklore and the ongoing life of a people, and traditions differ from community to community, right?
Correct.
Sephardic Jews follow certain culinary traditions, Ashkenazi Jews follow different traditions, Middle Eastern Jews follow traditions. The issue of law, and Talmudic law in particular as it evolved, was necessitated by the fact that Jews throughout the Middle Ages lived in separate communities, and they were so structured and designated by the law of the state. the Jews were granted a certain independence to apply their traditions within their community, their laws within their community, as long as they were responsive to paying their taxes and doing whatever was expected of them by the ruling monarch. So Jews were not integrated into the general life of the pre-state, and it took a while until they were integrated into the life of the nascent modern state, right? So it's not until the French Revolution that Jews are brought into citizenship, into the land where they live. And that process eventually happened also in the United States. So throughout the Middle Ages, Jews constituted a separate entity by designation of the state. And that allowed them to perpetuate their own traditions and at the same time be an easily disposable element or usable element, depending on the temperament and the nature of the society and of the ruler. So we know medieval structures, right? We talk about the church, the nobility, and the peasants. That's the classical medieval structure of society, right? The church, the nobility, and the rest of the folk. Well, in countries where Jews lived, they were a fourth entity. They were separate and granted a certain autonomy because they did not live by they were not nobility, they were not clergy, and they did not belong to the peasantry. They were a separate entity and they were so recognized. And we will see in a few moments, if we can get to that, how the church dealt with the Jews from the 3rd, 4th century on. So let's move on to that, because that is a good segue. Is that a French word, Camille? Segue?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The thing come to my mind about the ghettoization during that period of time.
Yeah, the ghetto is later. The word ghetto.
No, during the Middle Age, we had ghettos in France and in Germany.
Oh yeah, Jews lived in separate society, in separate areas, in separate societies. In different countries, it happened in different ways. The word ghetto is an Italian word. Mm-hmm. And it was given to the ghetto in Venice. Yes. The word is getto, and it comes from the word that means the iron foundry, because Jews were forced to live in the area which had once been the iron foundry in Venice, and it was referred to as the ghetto. So in the 16th century on, Jews in Venice were relegated to the ghetto, hence the word ghetto, and it becomes a universal term for societies that live separated, right? But before there was the official ghetto, Jews not only lived in separate communities, but had a different law. And here we will see why in the next 20 minutes. The sheet that is entitled The Christian Anti-Judaic Tradition. Jackie, please. We're gonna talk heavy stuff now, okay? With the development of Rabbinic Judaism following the destruction of the temple, there begin to emerge in the land of Israel different groupings. The followers of Jesus of Nazareth begin to distance themselves in the course of time from the people of Jesus. That is, because most Jews did not accept the messianic teachings of the church, and Christianity eventually becomes a dominantly Gentile religion, that is, a religion that is constituted by members who were not in origin Jewish. Remember, early Christianity were Jews who believed in the messiahship of Jesus. 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation, Christianity becomes a Gentile tradition, no longer identified with the temple, and in lesser degrees associated with the land of Israel. So it becomes a Gentile tradition. It is difficult to say when Christianity, qua Christianity, separates itself or is a distinct religion from Judaism. But certainly by the time of Constantine, the 4th century of the Common Era, 325, when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity now defines itself not only as other than Judaism, but against Judaism. And here are some painful texts from from Christian sources. In the Gospel of John, one of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, we find some of the most vituperative statements against the Jews, the synagogue of Satan. And that continues in many of the teachings of the early church fathers. St. John Chrysostom in the 3rd century, called the Golden Tongue. He was a great speaker. The synagogue, he told his congregants, is a criminal assembly of Jews, a place of meeting for assassins of Christ, a house of war, worse than a drinking shop, a den of thieves, etc., etc. St. Gregory of Nyssa calls Jews slayers of the Lord, murderers of the prophets. The accusation of deicide, the killing of God, appears for the first time in the 2nd century in Christian writing. Even Erasmus in the Middle Ages, who was kind of Renaissantist and beginning of more open thinking, didn't have very warm thoughts about the Jews. And if you lift it up, one more till the bottom, the greatest offender in the Christian church in the Middle Ages was Martin Luther, who leads the Protestant Revolution against Catholicism, hoping to gain Jews to join his brand of Christianity, and upon not succeeding, has very unpleasant things to say about the Jews, associating, Judas, the term Judas, who is the disciple that betrays Jesus in the New Testament, is now used in association with the Jews. And he has some very noble things to say. The devil has eased himself and emptied his belly again. And then the devil in his turn devours the swills that these good pupils spew and eject from above and below. The devil, with his angelic snout, devours and exudes from the oral and anal apertures of the Jews. This is his favorite dish. This is nasty stuff, right? Now, the current Lutheran Church has rejected and denounced these teachings of Martin Luther, but they are reflective of a teaching of Judaism that was typical in the echelons of the church. It is interesting why this becomes such a dominant tradition. Christianity defines itself not just as the religion of Jesus, who was a Jew himself, but a religion in apposition or in contrast to and in denunciation of Judaism. Let's take a look at the sheet that says the negation of the Jews and the church fathers, and afterwards, the negation of the Jews. Here we go. Could you raise it a little bit? Okay. So this is a sheet that Professor Clark Williamson and I use in great detail to teach at Christian Theological Seminary, a semester-long course on Jewish-Christian relations. But essentially, it shows you how the church fathers, who are the early teachers of the church, kind of the rabbis of the church tradition, begin to teach about Judaism. Jews are accused of crimes. Judaism is presented as a carnal, inferior religion of the law, as opposed to the spiritual religion of Christianity. The Hebrew Bible is used as a text not to show the teachings of Judaism, but just to justify and explain the coming of redemption, which comes with Jesus. And all of this has a structure. It's not just a teaching, but a legal and social structure. Representative samples of church laws. Beginning in the 4th century, 305, the Council of Elvira in Spain bans intermarriage between Jews and Christians. Now that's interesting. Why would you ban intermarriage between Jews and Christians? Because it must have been taking place. Christians still kind of hung around with Jews, right? It also says that it banned adultery between Christian men and Jewish women. That's interesting. You have to ban adultery. The Council of Nicaea legislates Easter to be celebrated the first Sunday after the first Mool after March 21st. That's kind of interesting, but why? To distance it from its association with Passover. And if you just look through those, Jackie, could you lift it a little bit? No, still first page. Yep, there, that's good. Just pick anything. Council of Antioch, 341, entry number 4. Christians may not observe Passover with Jews. Next one, Christians may not share feasts with Jews or accept gifts from Jews on the occasion of Jewish feasts. No marriageable member of the clergy may marry a Jew. Clergy must avoid Jewish feasts. Now, the only reason laws like that would be passed is because these things are taking place. And Jews and Christians are cohabiting, fraternizing, but the upper echelons of the church feel uncomfortable with this. Let's bring it down a little bit to the top of that page to see. Yeah, keep going. Okay, and there you keep going. The Fourth Lateran Council, entry number 21. The beginnings of distinctive garb for Jews and Saracens in this case. Yellow hat in France, oddly shaped hat in Poland. The badge or yellow sphere in France. Oxford, 1222, new synagogues may not be built. Breslau, 1261, Jews are sent to separate areas of living, ghettos. Basel, 1434, Jews may not obtain academic degrees. Which means that they used to. State laws begin to now reflect church law. In the Middle Ages, the pre-birthings of nationalism, kings and popes are always at each other's throats, and now canon law church law begins to make certain demands of the secular rulers. Then we have the Crusades in the Middle Ages, beginning with the First Crusade in 1096 and other crusades. These killed tens of thousands of Jews across the Rhine Valley. Popular charges, let's lift it up. There were 3 major accusations leveled against Jews during the Middle Ages. One was ritual murder. That is, the Jews during Passover capture a Christian child and kill him to reenact the killing of Jesus. Very many accusations of ritual murder throughout the Middle Ages. False, ungrounded. The next one, in the next page, the profanation of the host. Again, the presumption that Jews would steal the host of the bread of the Eucharist from a church and puncture it, thus once again killing Jesus. Hundreds of instances of this charge throughout the Middle Ages resulted in the murder of the Jews. Next one, the well poisoning in the 13th. Can that come up a little bit? The Black Death, which was the pandemic of the Middle Ages that spread across Europe, spawned charges that Jews were behind the plague, and because they were poisoning the wells of Christians and so forth. So throughout the Middle Ages, Jews had to deal with constant accusations of unfaithfulness to society, unfaithfulness to the true faith, And then there came expulsions of Jews in different stages. Could we raise that? Many expulsions. You're all familiar with the 1492 expulsion from Spain, but as far as the 2nd century, Hadrian expels the Jews from Jerusalem in 135, England 1290, 1306 from France, 1492, Spain, and then 1654, Jews who had settled in the southern coast of South America are expelled when the Portuguese take over the Dutch colony. And this is when Jewish life begins officially in North America in 1654, with 23 Spanish Jews escaping the Inquisition in South America, settle in New Amsterdam to become the first organized Jewish community in the United States. This gives you then a sense of the history, the dark side of the history between Judaism and Christianity that eventuates in modern anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism existed in various ways within the church. What we call anti-Semitism today, take a look at the second paragraph, second side, is a new term that was coined in Germany in the late 19th century. And it was now bringing religious anti-Semitism into a racist expression, into a nationalist expression. So anti-Semitism begins, or anti-Judaism begins, as a religious persecution, separation, expulsions of the Jews based on religion. In many cases, if you converted to Christianity, you could, overcome being treated as a Jew. But already in Spain, even conversion becomes problematic because the Inquisition was looking for pureza de sangre, purity of blood, which already kind of has this racist tinge. You could never escape your being Jewish. And with Germany, then the issue was not conversion or expulsion, but elimination. So that's the quickest survey I have ever given of the history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And I am going to pause there and let's go back to screen if you don't mind, so that you can understand how Judaism and Christianity, which emerge from separate interpretations of the biblical tradition in the 1st century of the Common Era, and are in many ways very similar in the early centuries, become, as a result of the Roman Empire and successive evolutions of time and space, antagonistic. That is, Christianity poses Judaism as antagonistic to its spiritual and physical existence. All of this begins to take a different turn in the 20th century. The Catholic Nostra Aetate documents of the 1960s begin to rectify the relationship of Christianity to Judaism. Judaism are beginning with the charge of deicide. Jews can no longer be regarded as God killers. That's what the word deicide means. Not Christ killers, but God killers. So Christianity rescinds that, and there begin to be efforts to bring Judaism and Christianity into dialogue and understanding. This eventually flows into the mainstream Protestant denominations. But till this day, the residue of religious anti-Judaism, compounded by by modern racial anti-Semitism, continue to plague society. And it has different manifestations in different times, but it is unfortunately part of the dark side of Western history. We have not gotten to the Middle Ages as I would have wanted. So we'll begin next time by talking a little bit about how the Middle Ages birth modernity. I want to tell you a little bit about Moses Maimonides, the great medieval philosopher that helps to shape Jewish legal and religious thought. Let me pause for 5 minutes of questions or comments. Sorry that I talked for so long, but there was a lot to pack in here today. Can we take 5 minutes or so of conversation?
Dennis,
Yes?
compared to when you grew up and to compare to now where you're living, would you say anti-Semitism in your experience is lessening compared to your early years, or is it on the rise?
You know, anti-Semitism ebbs and flows, and it has different manifestations in different times, and it comes from different segments of society. I think we are witnessing presently expressions of anti-Semitism from the right, and unfortunately also expressions of anti-Semitism from the left. Politics and economics and different trends in society kind of trigger different manifestations, which points to the fact that anti-Judaism, however you want to describe it, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, is, to use a term that is often used these days, endemic and systemic to Western culture. It doesn't mean that it cannot be overcome and has not been overcome in different ways. America has without a doubt been the country where Jews have been able to live in the most hospitable and open ways. However, today, many American Jews feel some insecurity from manifestations, and many European Jews as well. But I think that we live at a time when education and more open relationships can help us to overcome not only this expression of bigotry and hatred, but other racist expressions as well. So we have to be aware of it. And in many ways, anti-Semitism is a barometer. Wherever there is a little bit of that, you can anticipate there's going to be a little bit of other things as well, or a lot of it. Question, comments, refutals, denials.
For one of the statutes from Toledo, it's number 14. It says Jewish children are to be brought up by Christians. Were they physically taking Jewish children away from their parents, or was this like in the case of orphans, they would be given to Christian parents?
Who's asking the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, Michelle. Hi, I'm
Michelle.
waiting. Yeah.
Thank you. It probably means both. And this, the kidnapping of Jewish children by the church continued to take place into modernity, sometimes because Jewish children happened to be given into the care of the church for protection, and then they would take them over and not let them revert to their Jewish families when it was possible. There's a famous case, and you can look it up in your own time, Google it, the Mortara case, M-O-R-T-A-R-A, Mortara case. Look up the Mortara case, and you can report to it about it to me next week. Modern situation of a Jewish child being raised as a Christian and a struggle with the church. Yes, so it was in both directions. In the Middle Ages, by the way, as some Jews grew to become, or converts to Christianity, formerly Jews, assumed important positions within the Catholic hierarchy. Yeah. Okay, did we learn something today? A lot of stuff, right? Okay, read your books, whatever you have. There is a book that didn't make it into the bibliography, but I would like to recommend, if I didn't do so last week. It's called Essential Judaism by George Robinson. It's thick, but it's accessible and easy. It's kind of a manual. It takes you through different periods and important pieces of information. If I were to recommend one kind of comprehensive manual handbook of Judaism, this would be it. Essential Judaism by George Robinson. Highly suggested. Okay, go have some brunch or whatever it is that you, in Seattle, you can go and have your breakfast cup of coffee. Thank you all for joining. We will meet again next week, and kind of go ahead and read a little bit into the next period, the birthings of modernity and its impact on Judaism, or how Judaism impacts the birthing of modernity. It goes both ways.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi. And everyone, if you'd like a review of this class, you can find the recording on our YouTube channel, Congregation Beth-El Zedek. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, Jackie, for keeping us connected. Let's see, anything in the chat that didn't get attended? Thank you, everybody. Okay. Yep. Yes. Thank you. Tough stuff.